Ladies and gentlemen, you are very welcome indeed. And the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences is very happy to see all of you here. And the Academy have around 400 members. And I would say that quite many of us are operative and working in different positions within the Academy. And very many, of course, us, even when have left public office or private offices, make contributions due to the times that we are living in. And the Academy is also composed half-half between militaries and civilian. However, only 10% of us are women, and that's a lack, of course. We have already since we had the decree, 2 decrees by His Majesty then, in 1796 and 1805, to establish an academy. And it still works with 6 sections or divisions. That has, of course, been the major place for discussions and contributions during all times. However, around 1980, the Royal Academy of Sciences, in which place we are now situated and seated, they invited the then Academy of War Sciences to establish a way of being more of a think tank. And from that stem several reports which has contributed on defense policies in these very changing times, security policies, of course, but also military components. Now, we are, since 15 years back, I think that's an approximation, the Academy has contributed with proposals, ideas, analysis on how the world is elaborating itself, or is it not elaborating itself, since about 15 years ago back. Right now, we have one new sitting commission on these very subjects. And it is going to give, this is the halfway orientation. Where are we going? Where are we supposed to be? And of course, now it was happened these days and weeks, very much is problematic, has to be discussed once again. But the time seemed to me at least similar in some senses of the time when the Academy was founded, 1796 and 1805. What was going on in the European security context in these days? That was one of the reasons why younger officers took the initiative of establishing an academy. Now we are very pleased that you are many here, and we are very pleased that the present study group is able to introduce you to this, how things are standing, how they were 3 weeks ago, and how they are today. I want to finalize my introduction saying that funding has been granted for this project by Axel and Margaret Axelsson Jonsson Foundation. That is, we are very grateful for this contribution, making it possible for us to really bring up ideas and have them elaborated within our context. Ladies and gentlemen, you are indeed very welcome today. Please, Gunilla. Thank you.
Thank you, Björn. I'm Gunilla Herolf. I have been organizing this conference together with my colleagues and above all, Johan Lindevall. And we have been continually happy because we have seen what huge interest there has been for this conference. You are all very welcome. And you are all very welcome, you who are the speakers here. We are immensely happy that we got these extremely prominent people to come to Stockholm and speak on this theme, which we already in October thought was a very topical one, but little did we know. This conference, as Björn said, is part of the project which is called SVAR, Sweden in the EU and NATO, Deterrence and Resilience, where the head of the whole project is sitting there, Lars-Erik Lundin. And as we thought then, this is a necessity to have EU and NATO at the forefront of this project, among others, of course, because being a member of NATO, we have only been a member of NATO for less than 1 year. It's a new situation for us. We need to know more, and we need to think about our new role. But then we never imagined how crucial this issue would be. The rules-based world and Europe are now in a precarious situation, worse than we have seen for a very, very long time. The Russians are gloating, putting up new demands, and from the American side, we have recently heard accusations put up against Ukraine for having started the war. What can we more expect from the American side, and what can the Europeans do? The meetings after the Munich conference are now continuing, and as we see it, they will surely involve new surprises and also new question marks. But as I started to say, in this room, we are very fortunate to have this group of speakers with extraordinary knowledge in this area. And we hope they will straighten some of the question marks, and I feel that they will probably put up some more question marks for us to think about. So, therefore, I would like to introduce the first speaker here, who is Ambassador Veronika Wand-Danielsson, Swedish ambassador to Germany. Couldn't have been a more topical person. A few words about her. I can't read everything, but you have this small paper where you can see, so I just take the more substantial ones, start at the end. Minister Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Sweden to the EU, and thereafter, from 2007, she was appointed Swedish ambassador to NATO. Between 2014 and 20, she was ambassador to France, and between 2020 and 23, she was head of the Americas Department of MFA. Quite impressive and absolutely perfect for this conference. So please, Veronika.
Thank you, Gunilla. Yes, little had I known how quick things would change when I accepted in October to speak today. Esteemed members of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Science, Dr. Herolf, dear Gunilla, dear guests, dear friends, and nice to see many friends, old-time friends, in the room here today. I hope we'll have time to speak a little bit more between our discussions this afternoon. I'm indeed particularly pleased to have been invited to hold today's introductory speech to such a distinguished audience at your winter symposium. Or shouldn't we rather have called it Spring Symposium, which sounds a bit less gloomy and a bit more promising, as we today are to assess the future of Europe. To be able to look forward, allow me first to look back for a bit. Also, with my own personal experience and reflections, this is what you asked for, Gunilla, before adventuring myself to saying a few words on where I think Europe may be heading. And Björn, sorry to say, it will not only be looking 3 weeks back, but perhaps 15 years back. I have, as many of you know, followed the developments of European security and defense policies and ambitions, not only from a Swedish and a Brussels EU-NATO perspective, but also, as you were saying, from a French and today posted to Berlin, a German perspective. And I'm currently very keen to understand also where Germany may be heading. Before I turn to last weekend's Munich Security Conference, which I attended with government representatives and their prime minister, and the upcoming German elections, let me first, as I said, take a few steps back. A year ago, more precisely on the 7th of March 2024, the blue and yellow colors of Sweden's flag were raised for the first time outside the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And we became the 32nd member of NATO, the most enduring and the most successful alliance in history. Will it still be this way in the years to come? And this step was historical. We were watching history in the making. Looking back, I can still recall a time when I, as newly appointed Swedish ambassador to NATO, was invited to Folk and Försvar. Many of you used to attend these meetings as well. The famous Swedish security conference in Sälen. This was in January 2008. I was, however, recommended by a well-meaning colleague to better hide my NATO ambassador's name badge and to avoid talking about where I was working, as some participants might have found it disturbing, as many were not even aware, you will remember, that Sweden indeed had a Swedish diplomatic representation at the NATO headquarters with an ambassador heading the mission. And I remember well how awkward I felt, not really daring to admit my function, nor what organization I was working with. It was a time where civil servants at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I hope we don't have too many Ministry of Foreign Affairs colleagues here today, in preparing the yearly legal bill to Parliament regarding Sweden's military contribution to the ISAF operation in Afghanistan, tried to even avoid mentioning the fact that the mission was a NATO-led operation. They insisted and requested to rather refer to it as the UN-mandated International Security Assistance Support Mission. I would for many years come across even Swedish parliamentarians, Björn, just saying, not you, who thought that the ISAF mission was indeed a UN-led intervention. Meanwhile, in 2011, when ISAF was at its peak, NATO had approximately 130,000 soldiers under its command from 42 countries. This is more than double the today 40,000 strong force of soldiers, sailors, and airmen that NATO permanently has in its high readiness NATO response force, the NRF, that is ready to react in a crisis. In those days, NATO's main focus was indeed on international crisis management operations. After the SFOR and KFOR operations in the Balkans during the 90s, the ISAF mission in Afghanistan became the most important and demanding crisis management operation, not only for NATO allies, but also for the participating troop contributing partner countries. It dominated the alliance political and military agenda and resources for more than a decade. I can vividly recall the then German Minister of Defense, Ursula von der Leyen, in the German and European parliaments, defending the position that Germany's security begins at the Hindu Kush. This was considered a bold statement in Germany. Would she defend that position still today? I doubt it. In parallel with the ongoing ISAF operation, NATO was able to successfully run the military Operation United Protector in Libya, further increasing NATO's focus on international crisis management. Sweden's much appreciated JAS Gripen contribution to the OUP mission gave us a prominent role among NATO's partners. Today, looking back, I would claim that NATO's role and political relevance was due to not only the military interoperability it provided, but to a large extent also to the political interoperability, both among allies, but not the least between allies and close partners. This was primarily achieved thanks to the ISAF operation, I would still claim today. NATO's strengthened political role and relevance, both in Europe and globally, was a result of the operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. NATO thereby enhanced not only its military capabilities and crisis management roles and tools, but also its political relations with partners in and outside the alliance, from European partners such as Sweden, Finland, or Austria, to the countries in the Mediterranean, as well as to global partners such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. I would furthermore claim that the political smoothness with which Sweden and the Swedish public accepted and eventually supported the Swedish decision to join NATO was largely the effect of many years of positive experiences and cooperating with NATO through Sweden's participation in the NATO-led operations. NATO-led missions were broadly considered as professional and well conducted in comparison to the often criticized UN-led missions, which Sweden also contributed to. And as a result, more countries wished to join the alliance, countries in the Balkans, as well as countries in the Caucasus, such as Georgia and Ukraine, for whom, however, Russia was the key factor then already. The same countries wished simultaneously to join also the EU, thereby confirming their European and Euro-Atlantic integration, which they saw and still see as mutually reinforcing processes not able to replace each other. Did NATO go too far, do too much, become too popular? Was the political development of the alliance in and outside Europe, and anchored in NATO's strategic concept of 2010, referred to as cooperative security, was this already seen as a threat by NATO's main antagonist, Russia? NATO's changing, Europe is changing. One may discuss when Russia, who, by the way, supported NATO's operations in Afghanistan, returned to become a threat. To some, the threat from Russia never disappeared. Ask, for example, our friends in Georgia or Moldova, which have struggled with an unwanted Russian military presence on their respective territories since the 1990s, if not since decades or even centuries before this. Others point to when Putin in 2005 called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, or to this revanchist speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where his neo-imperialistic ambitions were barely hidden. A year and a half later, this was followed up through Russia's open military aggression against Georgia. But even then, alas, many did not get the message. 2014, when so-called little green men suddenly showed up in Crimea, and heavily armed so-called separatists started a rebellion in eastern Ukraine, the picture, however, got clearer. NATO and its member states realized that Russia was no longer a partner, if it had ever been one. It is no secret that different NATO members made different assessments of the threat from Russia, but at the Wales summit, they all agreed that, quote, Russia's aggressive actions against Ukraine have fundamentally challenged our vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, and allies committed to move towards the 2% guidelines within a decade. We're getting there. They are getting there. We're getting there jointly. And they also decided to establish a very high readiness joint task force, among other things. The world had changed, and so had NATO. There was still a need for crisis management, but collective defense, territorial defense, and deterrence were back as main points on the agenda. For Sweden, Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the wake-up call. The same year, Sweden entered a tailor-made partnership with NATO with the status of enhanced opportunities partner together with Finland. And Sweden also reactivated conscription in 2017 and took first steps in increasing its defense expenditure. With Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, the Swedish government, the Swedish parliament, and not the least, the Swedish population, saw and accepted the necessity to join NATO, hand in hand with Finland. Sweden witnessed the largest and fastest shift of public opinion in Swedish history. In 2021, only 29% of the population supported NATO membership. Today, the support is above 65%, the Swedish Zeitenwende. The decision to join NATO was, as we know, the direct consequence of Russia's antagonistic behavior and its illegal, unprovoked, and indefensible war of aggression against Ukraine. It implied a historic paradigm shift of Sweden's defense and security policy since the Napoleonic Wars. With this move, Sweden left behind more than 2 centuries of military non-alignment. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson described Sweden's NATO accession as epoch-making for Sweden and for the Swedish people. The integration of Sweden and Finland in NATO has redrawn the European security map. It has both enlarged and strengthened NATO, and it has militarily strengthened both Sweden and Finland. Today we can adapt our defense and contingency plans, counting on the additional support of allies if we were to be threatened or attacked, and vice versa. Sweden and Finland's acceptance as new NATO members was at the time a clear rejection of Russia's demand for a veto right as regards other countries' legitimate national security choices, as expressed explicitly in the demands put forward by Russia in December 2021. Sweden and Finland firmly rejected these demands and exercised the principle at the heart of the European security order, the right of each state to freely make its own security policy choice, as also defined in the Charter of Paris, which Russia, to set the record straight, also agreed to. So where do we stand today? Ukraine has the same fundamental right to choose its own security policy. And this fundamental right is today not only questioned as a hypothetical policy issue, but Russia is waging a war against a neighbor that sought to exercise that right. Next week, as I said earlier, on the 24th of February, it will be 3 years since the beginning of Russia's brutal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in blatant violation of international law, including the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. And as already mentioned, but worth emphasizing, Russia's invasion indeed started already in February 2014 with the invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia's attack on Ukraine marks an irreversible tipping point for Swedish, European, and global policy, security policy. Russia's goal is obviously to forcibly overthrow the European security order. Russia has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to use military force to achieve its political goals. Russia has also gradually withdrawn from the constraints of arms control and increased the repression against its own people, particularly against those critical of its aggressive behavior against other countries. And Russia is clearly prepared to take very big risks and accept large-scale losses, not least in human lives, both in terms of its own citizens and others. It is now reorganizing its society and economy for a prolonged war effort. And we also see a significant increase in hybrid activities and suspicious incidents, such as destroyed underwater cables and other critical infrastructure, notably in the Baltic Sea region. For many security experts and analysts, the quantity and quality of these likely hybrid attacks against NATO allies could already be considered enough to activate Article 4 or Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So far, the attribution is not sufficiently clear, although there's hardly any doubt that it is Russian hybrid interference in the West, also using proxies, that is responsible for much of the antagonistic behavior that we see. Russia is sending a clear signal that it has the capability to strike anywhere at any time, stoking fear among the European population, in particular in Germany. And further to Russia's operations in the gray zone of hybrid threats, we have in the past years increasingly witnessed large-scale disinformation campaigns in several European countries, in particular during election times, but also an increasing number of cyber attacks or even the instrumentalization of migrants. It is in this new reality and the realization that Europe needs to plan and prepare for a long-term confrontation with Russia that forces inter alia Sweden and Finland to fundamentally reevaluate and change our security policy. The importance of Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine and its antagonism and hybrid measure against us cannot be understated. These activities are all interrelated. We need to further develop our situational awareness, connecting the dots. This cannot, and draw the right conclusions. This is what we need in the short run. If Russia were to succeed in Ukraine, the consequences would be extreme. The flagrant violation of a democratic state's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity would be made permanent. The right of the mighty at the expense of the rule of law. The conclusion in Moscow, and probably elsewhere too, is that aggression indeed pays off. Russia's already close cooperation with the authoritarian states, such as China, Iran, and North Korea, would likely intensify even further. Another conclusion could be that nuclear weapons, which Ukraine refrained from in return for security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum, are needed for future deterrence, and that nuclear weapons can also be used to facilitate aggression, which Russia has demonstrated. And in Germany, that threat works particularly well. We would thus face an increased risk of proliferation. But most importantly, Ukraine and Ukrainians would suffer in terms of land, lives, infrastructure, and environment. Potentially millions would seek refuge elsewhere, mainly within the EU, and those staying would suffer under Russian occupation. All too well, we remember the horrors discovered in Bucha, in Borodyanka, in Irpin, in Izium, after they were so-called liberated. When we today talk about allowing Russia to keep Ukrainian occupied territory, we know what will happen to the millions of Ukrainians left behind. We must also not forget about the many thousands, including children, that have been deported to Russia. If successful in Ukraine, Russia would undoubtedly improve its military strategic position vis-à-vis the EU and NATO, including towards Ukraine's western neighbors in the Black Sea area. The Russian threat against us would not disappear nor even diminish. On the contrary, Russia would be able to redirect many resources currently put to use in Ukraine to intensify its perceived fight against other countries. I have already mentioned Moldova and Georgia, but also countries in the Western Balkans and within the EU and NATO would be an increased risk of Russian destabilization or even aggression. Let us not fool ourselves. A future deal or even a ceasefire would not prevent Russia from continuing its aggression against Ukraine with further military violence at some later stage, such as happened after the Minsk agreements. Also, election interference is part of the new realities, and not only from Russia, it appears. We saw it in Georgia, Moldova, and Romania, and now in the upcoming elections in Germany. The German authorities are now issuing clear warnings about various Russian operations. On an almost daily basis, the German newspapers write about suspected sabotage activities, drones over German military facilities, smear campaigns, unclear financing of extremist parties, etc. And even though there's often no smoking gun, available evidence seems to point towards Russia. Against this sobering background, ladies and gentlemen, where is Europe heading? Where is Germany heading? After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we did not see a continued irreversible spread of democracy and freedom as we all hoped, nor did we see the end of the Cold War. Clearly, history is not linear. It serves as a warning, but let's not forget, it can also give rise to hope. The wall was built, but did come down, even though few expected it at the time, and even though mental walls remain. Central European states suffered under Moscow's control, but did eventually join NATO and the EU, and they prospered. Russia supported the bloody Assad regime, but Assad did eventually fall, and Russia has been put on the back foot in the region. Today, Ukraine is defending itself against Russia's aggression, but Ukraine has shown immense bravery and resolve and is fighting back courageously. Even this, a lesson for the West, and Ukraine can still succeed. But Europe, firstly, needs to fully understand how serious the situation is and then find the political courage to decide devoting sufficient resources to it. After my days at Munich Security Conference last weekend, this has become, to me, even clearer than ever. Germany so far, I will talk a little bit more now about Germany since this is my posting where I'm based right now. So far, I have unfortunately too often perceived a certain lack of understanding for what is at stake, also for our own security, the European security. But I've also found a missing sense of urgency and some vague war fatigue in many places, not the least in the country in which I serve today, Germany. Allow me therefore to say a few more words about that country to better understand future possibilities, but also constraints as regards today's expectations on Europe. In fact, when we talk about Germany, we talk about Europe and the EU. And when we refer to the EU, we constantly must remind ourselves that we have 27 European member states who all have their own geography, their own history, their own experiences from which they draw their own different lessons. That defines their own national policies and thereby their view about the future, also their own future. The 27 EU member states also have different threat perceptions. For the northern, eastern, and not the least the Baltic states, Russia is indeed the main and even an existential threat, which therefore also clearly defines their views, our common stance on Ukraine. From Paris, Rome, or Madrid, Russia is geographically further away and therefore not perceived as a direct threat to their own national security interests. The importance of history and how it defines a country's foreign and security policy is particularly striking in Germany. Living and working in Berlin, every street, every square is a constant reminder of Germany's recent history. The consequences of Germany's role and responsibility for World War II, as well as the consequences of a divided country during the Cold War period. And I would claim divided in many Germans' minds still today. Most Germans still wish and hope for status quo, and even long for going back to yesterday. Ja, gestern, da war die Welt noch in Ordnung. A potential new peace deal with Russia could perhaps even allow to go back to Mutti's good old times, when it was possible to buy cheap gas and oil from Russia, and if possible, to continue selling German quality cars to China. Chancellor Scholz has indeed to be applauded that he, 3 days after the Russian attack on Ukraine, held a historic speech in the German Bundestag, the Zeitenwende speech. For those that haven't read it, it is translated in English. It is still today worthwhile reading. It laid the ground for a fundamental change of Germany's foreign, security, and energy policy. This was brave and admirable. But was it a fundamental change? From initially providing helmets, Germany is today one of the largest military supporters to Ukraine, almost as large as the collective Nordic-Baltic group. Too often, however, self-restrictions are imposed, often with reference to false or sometimes dubious assumptions that Russia cannot be defeated militarily, and that all wars have to end in peace negotiations, but also that increased military support would increase the risk of escalation and increase the threat on Germany. 3 years later, after the speech, I note a certain backsliding in Europe's biggest and richest country, and the reasons are numerous. Germany's, as I said, recent history explains to a large extent the German angst to get involved in a new war, in particular with Russia. Therefore, the German attitude is to sometimes pretend not to fully understand, or rather not wanting to fully understand the world in which they live. One of Germany's leading security experts explained to me only recently, Veronika, it's like a little child. The Germans will often put their hands in front of their eyes, hoping that no one will even notice them. A conscious policy approach referred to as strategic naivety. Instead, for many years, Germany's main focus, as the third largest world economy, has been and still is on international trade and on strengthening its economic strength and role in and outside Europe. And despite Germany's total dependency on free global maritime trade flows, also through the Indo-Pacific region, no German politician would openly consider discussing or even planning for how free navigation on these seaways should be kept free, or whether Germany could even consider using military force to defend such strategic economic interests. It's an attitude referred to by many leading military experts as sometimes an irresponsible German naivety. And it is to a large extent the result of decades of influence of the victorious powers, reminding the Germans of their responsibility for World War II, and thereby keeping Germany away from any major security and/or military role. German politicians will happily accept that European defense of military responsibilities were best handled by other nations. Germany could at most engage itself in UN-mandated international crisis management operations. These days, as the Nordic and Baltic countries are in the process of implementing the concept of total defense, we are often asked to present the approach in Germany. And it is quite striking, however, to see the strong German reactions to this concept considered absolutely impossible for Germany, as most Germans are not even fully conscious, nor do they really want to be, of the threats that Russia today poses. And the German government does not want to speak openly about current threats, fearing that it would only strengthen the extremist right and left parties, AfD and Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, who immediately would accuse them of being warmongering. However, not being clear about the threats that both China and Russia pose to Germany and Europe, the necessary precautions nor the necessary planning is being taken. Recently, the city of Kiel entered a friendship agreement with the Chinese town of Qingdao, realizing too late that Qingdao is the center of maritime warfare and research on submarines, while Kiel is one of Germany's biggest navy bases. The more classical example of German sometimes naivety was, of course, the gas pipeline project with Russia, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Pursued without wanting to know nor understand the worsening situation in Russia and the potential consequences of developing such a strong dependency to Moscow. Germany has for too long had its focus on promoting its economic strength while outsourcing its security to the US and NATO. This approach was perhaps understandable during the initial post-Cold War period. Today, it is considered politically quite irresponsible not to have understood the changing international world order and to therefore prepare adequately. A lot is at stake for the Germans. Its economy is entering a third year of recession. For the German automobile industry, as well as for the chemical industry, China remains the main export country they do not want to lose. So cutting ties with China is therefore unthinkable, also according to Ola Källenius, the CEO of Mercedes-Benz Group. This explains that only few steps have been taken to implement, for instance, the EU's agreed policy on de-risking dependency to China. German business leaders do not want to see that China is not only a partner, rival, and competitor, but that China is also a strategic adversary with a long-term ambition to change the world system to meet its own authoritarian interests. Germany's political leaders would need to engage much more actively with the important German business community and industry to jointly assess, discuss, and decide on a new strategy for Germany, ensuring clearer interface between geopolitics and geoeconomics. So let me end by talking about what needs to be done. In Munich last weekend, the Trump II administration's message to Europe was loud and clear. Europe has to step up and take the main responsibility for its own security. And here, President Trump is right. It is primarily a task for us Europeans. Europe has indeed, for too long, taken our transatlantic allies for granted. Let us take these very clear US demands as an opportunity for Europe to become stronger and more assertive, It is in fact not only about burden sharing, but rather about taking on and sharing political and military responsibilities. Today, I'm looking forward to listening to some of the many brilliant security experts gathered here today and on what steps they think should be taken. Let me, however, end with in my own humbleness, sharing with you some preliminary thoughts on how I think Europe could position itself in the coming months and years ahead, disregarding so-called peace deals or not with Russia. And many, bear with me, of these ideas are of course not new, and they were discussed intensively already in the margins of the Munich Security Conference. First and foremost, Europe must continue supporting Ukraine. If we reduce our support for Ukraine, the risk of Russia's escalation against Ukraine and other European and NATO countries would directly increase. Let us in this context not forget Bismarck's assessment. Russia is never as strong as she appears or as weak as she seems. European countries, particularly Germany, given the size and the importance in developing European common policies, need to accept and strive for a stronger security and defense policy role in Europe, primarily through a European pillar in NATO, as a means also to uphold and keep the US engaged, but also through a stronger EU. The strategic change of security policy needs to be explained and defended towards the German population, towards all populations for all countries. But the populations have to understand where they stand. And for Germany, this is particularly difficult given the recent reasons I shared with you, and given not the least Germany's recent history. European countries have to accept the new geopolitical realities and take on new responsibilities in a rapidly changing world and world order. In Europe, Germany cannot be expected to continue projecting economic strength without a substantial military basis, including required capabilities. As all other European NATO allies, also Germany's, need to increase its defense spending substantially. 2% is only a base plate. As regards nuclear deterrence and defense, NATO is the only game in town at this stage. A continued strong transatlantic link benefits both sides of the Atlantic. Should, however, the US decide to withdraw the nuclear umbrella over Europe, the French and UK nuclear capabilities need to be further developed and enhanced and extended to cover Europe's nuclear deterrence. Stronger interoperability among European militaries, common standards, and in particular investing in the development of European key capabilities, such as the much-needed air defense, but also airborne ISR, as well as strategic airlift capabilities and ammunitions, which not the least the war with Ukraine shows us over and over again. Ukraine within NATO would be a security provider. With the strategic geography, enlarged and today experienced armed forces, NATO membership remains the best security guarantee for Ukraine. A strengthened defense industry cooperation among European countries and between European and transatlantic partners is of course needed. EU-NATO. The threat from Russia has again underlined the importance of a well-functioning division of labor between NATO and the EU, making better use of the EU's policy toolbox. The EU has plenty to offer to complement NATO's efforts: finance, military mobility, regulatory powers, and tools to prevent and counter also various hybrid threats, such as disinformation. The EU is indeed one essential side, it's one side of the coin. But with all due respect to Article 42.7, it cannot replace at this stage Article 5 of NATO. The two organizations therefore need to continue cooperating and complementing each other to the benefit of both. Ladies and gentlemen, the above suggestion still implies, however, that Europe at this stage should have no illusions of replacing NATO and its common transatlantic security and therefore defense posture. Let us see where we are in 10 years' time. First, Europe needs to become a stronger partner and actor, foremost for its own security, but of course also to the yes in NATO and beyond, thereby also gaining more respect, influence among global partners. The transatlantic relations are, as we all see, currently going through uncertain times, unpredictable times. But let us not forget that there have been other moments in history that were both uncertain and unpredictable. Let us use these changing times as an opportunity to question our own, sometimes naive beliefs, and instead rapidly address our insufficient military preparedness while maintaining realistic ambitions. Sweden is ready to do its part. And now, a few days before the German elections, I'm not alone in hoping for a new, strong German government that can take on an inclusive leadership in this key hour in European history. And as I stated earlier, Europe is a community of 27 sovereign countries with different historic backgrounds and experiences. We will never be able to act as one unified country and can therefore not compare ourselves, nor with the US, nor with China. We can, however, become much more capable, more assertive, and more autonomous, also by becoming more flexible. For instance, my personal thoughts, why not consider in the context of NATO stronger, deepened regional poles, such as the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, sharing assets, surveillance, air and maritime policing? A lot of this is already happening, including through cooperation also with others, notably Poland and Germany, but also the UK or the Netherlands. It seems not only cost-effective and coherent, given the closeness of the countries, but also an adequate way of countering shared threats. Most of all, we need to uphold and defend our common values. It is time for Europe to take on a greater responsibility, and it is time for Germany, as the largest country in Europe, to take on a stronger security and military role, first and foremost in the context of NATO, as well as in the EU, and also as regards its support to Ukraine. In a time where the continental plates are moving, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to act. Thank you, and bearing with me. It was a long speech, I know. Thank you.
Or a few questions, but I can start with mine very egoistically. You mentioned the first period when we should have listened to what we actually heard, 2005, 2007, 2008, of course. How much could we have done at that time? We should have realized something was wrong, but what kind of means against Russia could we have taken at that time? I'll go and get my pen.
Can you still, yes. You went back to, I would say, my early NATO days. It was international crisis management operations were at the core of NATO's activities. Sweden and Finland sat in the same building as Russia. We had close, working relations. Dmitry Rogozin was the Russian NATO ambassador, quite active, quite involved, close relations with most countries on a personal level. I would claim until 2011, basically until the Libya operation, I think there was still hope to bind in Russia also, and the understanding for NATO's agenda. And don't forget, the Afghanistan operation, Sophie, you were also covering that period, was important for Russia. After their own experiences, Afghanistan, drugs, the worry that they would influence and destabilize the borders of Russia, I can still remember discussions we had with the Russian ambassador. They were unhappy to see the Obama administration talking about drawdown and eventually leaving, because they saw the worry of a destabilized region so close to their own borders. I would rather say the wake-up call, we should have perhaps understood the developments, and I think our country, the Nordic-Baltic country, did, looking at Russia proper. The neglect, I think, was rather among the allies as of 14, which was such a clear moment. Not going back to, at that point, we were just partners observing what was happening. But two big countries, even after when you saw the Russians coming into Crimea, The two capitals, Paris and Berlin, did not really want to accept what they saw because there was just too much at stake, and there was still the hope we can bind in Russia economically through our economic and political partnerships and thereby control the developments of Russia. So I think economic interests, not the least on the German side, the energy dependency, were still so strong that they did not really want to see what was happening in Russia proper, or still hoping that this economic dependency would in a positive way influence Russia and keep them basically, avoid at least military conflict.
Yeah, thank you. First question from Marianne Lanatza.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I have 3 small comments. The first one, when you mentioned the word order and how this war and some earlier with Georgia and so on regarding Russia. But I will say it started the new chapter and the very destructive one when Britain and US invaded Iraq in 2003 without the support of the Security Council. So that is counted in, I work with Middle East, North Africa, and that is the point I say it's a turning point, not Ukraine or Georgia, in cooperation and coordination. The second thing is that the Energy Charter Treaty, this big agreement, this was, Sweden and everybody was in favor of it. It's more than 50 countries who have signed it. And so everybody had, as in Europe and in the beginning also US, had the same image and dreams about a very close energy cooperation between Europe and Russia. And all the purpose of that big agreement is that we will put all the eggs in the same basket, the Russian one. So it's not only the German which really step up to defend Russia. And my third point is that it is something that very few are aware of, because we knew that the German economy in Europe, since the European Economic Community was created, was the strong one, the locomotive in that process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and why? Because it could get all products inputs without control from Eastern Germany in their products, which make them much cheaper, like Europe and the Americans have done with inputs from China later on. They could do it, and that internal trade was seen as an acceptable thing written in all the agreements involved in trade. So this agreement is for everybody, but not for the Germans' internal trade. And as far as I had understood, this is the understanding on a strong German economy. So that makes it difficult for them to just suddenly...
Yes, I mean, we will probably have different views on. I think it's particularly important in what you say is that looking back in history, there have often been moments of crisis also in the alliance. I mean, now we have an enormous crisis. I think we've not seen the full extent of it. So the historic perspectives, I think, are, of course, always important. It's not like it's up in motherhood and apple pie since the alliance was created or established. But if we talk about now the German perspective, you are right. There was an economic model, not the least after unification, that the various German governments, but also not the least the Merkel era of 16 years of chancellorship. For her, it was important, and she has now written her memoirs, and she tries to explain that her perspective. Unification was at the center of her attention as well, and the economic model was to be able to maintain a strong German economy through cheaper, a better energy policy, cheap access to cheaper gas and oil from Russia, and giving with the heavy industry they have, having China as an export market, and thereby hoping that becoming stronger and more prosperous, this would also unite the two Germanys more easily. There were, of course, major investments made, and thank God, in Eastern Germany. And I think this is how she partly explained/excuses and said, yes, maybe I should have done much more, maybe I should have been more aware, but at the time when I took these decisions, for me it was important that East Germany had lived under totally different circumstances, under the SED rule and at the end of the day, Moscow's rule. They had to become democratic, they had to prosper, they had to see the economic and political and democratic benefit of unification. So she might not have spoken much about I mean, she does it now that she's getting older and she wrote the memoirs. She didn't speak much about her Eastern German background, but of course it strongly influenced her. And I can, having listened, was one very good interview with her where she was very clear and said, yes, I mean, partly I probably did mistakes in underestimating who I was dealing with, but for me it was so important that East Germans should accept unification and should feel that they are part now of one new sort of united Germany. And this would only come if they saw that they became more prosperous, that they had a better, that they had a better economic situation. You still today, 2025, have differences in salaries, differences in conditions. They don't have the same political influence. If you look at who sits in steering boards in most big German companies, I think there's 3 or 4% of the board members have an East German background. So they have not done, and there's also the self-assessment is going on right now as we speak. German politicians will today accept that this has been an issue, particularly after they saw how the map now looks in before the elections, how strongly the extremist parties have grown and how strong they are in the East German states. Because all of a sudden they feel that, no, we have not been fully integrated. We have a bit this feeling of second-class citizens. We're supposed to put everything back and forget everything, also the good sides that many still felt that they also experienced under the when they were two separate states. So there is a sort of, and I think this, I'm trying to understand, speaking to many Germans, where does this, for me it was, I must say, a big surprise coming to Germany. I followed that country, I have a half German background. If you sit in Brussels or in Paris, what happens in Germany is so defining for everything that Europe does, and not the least when you have a Paris perspective. But I had not fully understood until I now came to Berlin, probably a year and a half ago, how divided and how deep that still is. You can meet people, young students between 20, 25 years old that will still talk in terms of, no, I cannot go, ich kann nicht rübergehen, I can't go to the other side. And I said, what's the other side? And they speak in terms of Leipzig. This is a young student from Leipzig. I cannot study in any, what they still say, West German university. For me, this was an enormous surprise that 2024, 25, you still speak in terms of, you can talk in terms of East and West Germany or going rüber to the other side. And what some now, even Weber Bas, the chairman of we had a long discussion with the chairman of the Bundestag, this feeling has become stronger after the war in Ukraine. I mean, all of a sudden, old images come back, old pictures, the whole East-West division, which they had put aside for many years. In the beginning, it was an enthusiasm, integration, opportunities, Europe as a whole, not only Germany. And these past 3 years of war, of security debate, has changed the mentality, and I think that also contributes to questioning the fear for Russia, the Friedenskanzler, as Chancellor Scholz is called, that feeling, the support for peace, any kind. I mean, many in East Germany probably think a peace talk now, peace agreement with Russia is good. We want peace, and not looking further down the road what that would imply. That is a certain worry I have, that some will jump on this because it all sounds very nice with peace, but not seeing what the long-term consequences risks being.
We have 1 minute left, and this is a challenge for Mikael Holmström and for you as well.
Oh, Mikael, again.
I have a question because you were in Munich.
Yeah. Sorry.
Excuse me, there's a microphone between every seat.
Hmm.
You can just,
Short question because you were in Munich and you can see NATO is actually, I see it more as a political alliance who has a military capability to make it probable, I mean, to deter. And that these values, freedom, respect for international law and so on, has been the core of this transatlantic alliance. But now the biggest country, US, as a leader who obviously doesn't respect these values and even want to reward an aggressor, Putin. And how do you think that will affect NATO?
I think this will be the discussion of this afternoon. And it's already, Mikael, I think we are all in this room, and we just had an instructive lunch. Every paper, every tweet, I just now see an enormous nervousness, and of course there's an enormous nervousness at NATO headquarters, definitely. It was a bombshell, yes, I would not, if I'm honest, this was of course the effect of the Vice President's speech primarily, and actually he did not speak about security and defense. He had another, I think it is still, we are all in a situation, the Swedish government, all capitals. Paris, I think, as we speak, have a video conference with those not invited to the famous meeting. Maybe Portugal is invited now this time. Hello, it's good to see you. No, we have to assess and see and understand what's lying behind. There are many speculations right now, and I think we should refrain from becoming totally public, not getting hysterical, but going back and looking in each capital first. This was the main content of my speech. I hope you listened. We have to do much more. That is not new. I think at least we have been in contact since 2007, my first early days at NATO. Obama already, Robert Gates, defense minister before he left in 2008, gave his major speech in Brussels, which was then already, you have to step up, you have to invest more in your defense, you have to meet the 2%, and this was before territorial defense became an issue. So the line, as I also said there, Trump is right. We have, and not the least Germany, other countries have had, UK and France are in a different situation. Germany has had outsourced its security policy, but this also in agreement with the alliance. This is also, I can both explain German history, and that they became the economic powerhouse and security was dealt by others. This was also wanted. Remember still the old phrasing, keep the Americans in, Germans down, and Russian out. This was sort of the working modus operandi for many, many years. Now there is a certain shell shock, of course, after those statements.
Now we have Americans out and the Russians in, and the Germans still down.
Yeah. I think it is too early, and I think we should be careful and not. I think that we have to do planning, yes, and we have to talk to each other, and most importantly, we have to stay united. And I would go beyond only EU27. Yes, there are certain countries today within EU27 who take different positions. So therefore, we have to look Europe as a whole, other partners. NATO developed during these years global partnerships. We have Australia, we have Canada. Look at Turkey, very interesting. Turkey, who has always been a difficult partner, common interest on certain issues, all of a sudden they clearly stand up in support of Ukraine. They will not like a potential agreement between Russia and the US. So we will see a lot of changes in the coming weeks and months, and I would not disregard that US who came out, now it was Vance, some in Munich claimed we don't have, you can disregard what he said because he's actually talking to the American public and not to European. There might be some truth in that as well. It's all too early to now make, it would be a big mistake of me if I now sat and explained it all to you. We will all be sitting, listening, trying to analyze, talking to the Americans and showing what's at stake. The transatlantic trade is important, for instance, just take the economic figures, is as important for the US and also for Mr. Trump. He will not want to lose Europe because also of his, not the least, when you have a country and a presidency which is so transactional in its approach. So I think the discussion have to continue, but we should not be naive. We have to take the tough discussions, and I would say for Germany, not during an election week, because again, I think I fully understand that nor the CDU leader or the SPD chancellor will make, it's not part of the debate much. And I can understand because it would only strengthen the extremist parties. So I think they need some calm in Berlin and in Germany so they can undertake their elections. And they probably already have to be careful not having too much influence, nor American and nor Russian. which is bad enough that we have to even say such a thing and see this as a risk. And I don't think it will strongly affect the elections. But I think we have a German ambassador in this room. She's probably better adapted to, hey, Christina, to answer those kind of questions. But then we have to inform our population. Investing in defense is difficult to get political support. I think our countries haven't been much more honest and open, and this already since 2014. That explains, I think, the fact that we join NATO more easily. In Germany, to put a lot of money in defense is not an easy debate because it's been so absent. It's easier in some other countries, but look, Italy, Southern European countries. I'm always surprised to see Portugal, for instance, when we have the Portuguese ambassador here, is very strong in its support among the countries with the highest support for Ukraine and for military support to Ukraine. So there we have, even in Southern Europe, variations. But those that are think tanks, and yes, I've seen some flows. I mean, some are already in World War III. I think the more we have is i magen, that's a very good expression sometimes, and wait and don't jump the guns, talk, be united, but do the investments, work together. The capabilities are needed. All that preparatory work to show that we actually can do and act much more than we have done so far. That will be my main humble recommendation, but then I'm not the security expert, you guys are.
You certainly are. Thank you so much. Wonderful.